new librarian at Memorial Library, and we are having a poetry reading on May 1st to celebrate National Poetry Month, which is actually April. But we figured we should do it on reading day because all of you will be free and you will be wanting to come to our poetry reading because you're free on reading day. So I've got handouts here. I gave some of you some handouts. Not a very good public speaker. I'm a librarian. So get a handout. Talk to Chrissy. She'll tell you how awesome poetry is. And then come to our poetry reading on May 1st at 1 o'clock at the library outside at the Adirondack chairs. Thank you.
All right, so at this point, if you have a cell phone, could you make sure that it is turned off? Following the reading, our poet will take questions, and then we'll have books for sale up front, which he would be happy to sign for you. So thank you all for coming to this event in the Department of English, Rhetoric and Writing reading series, and happy Poetry Month. Today's reading is brought to you by the Georgia Poetry Circuit and by Berry College. So I'm happy now to introduce to you Paul Hostovsky. Paul's poems have been featured on Poetry Daily, Verse Daily, and the Writer's Almanac. He has been published in Carolina Quarterly, Shenandoah, New Delta Review, Bellevue Literary Review, Atlanta Review, Poetry East, The Sun, and many other journals and anthologies. He has won a Pushcart Prize, the Comstock Review's Muriel Craft Bailey Award, and chapbook contests from Grayson Books, Riverstone Press, Frank Catt Press, and Split Oak Press. He has four full-length collections of poetry: Bending the Notes, Dear Truth, A Little in Love a Lot, and Hurt into Beauty. He makes his living in Boston as a sign language interpreter at the Massachusetts Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. In a recent interview, when asked about the reason behind his newest collection, Hurt into Beauty, Paul replied, "None of my poems have reasons. I think a good poem is the opposite of reason, insanity, to rave." This frankness, at once funny and dead serious, is a characteristic apparent in his approach to the subjects of his poems and in his view of his own identity as a writer. If you visit his website, you'll read his brief biography in his own words, including these: "Paul has no life and spends it with his poems, trying to perfect their perfect disappearances," which is the working title of his new collection, which is looking for a publisher and for itself. He is the recipient of such rebukes as, "You never want to do anything," and "All you care about are your stupid, clever poems." On a more serious note, a key tone Paul's work again and again returns to is his love-hate relationship with sound. How attuned he is to the music of silence, to the language that hands can make out of air. My own personal favorite Hostovsky poem, The Violence of Violins, the opening poem of Hurt into Beauty, touches on this, as well as on how he believes, as he said in interviews, that though he hates violence, sometimes it seems that everything that is beautiful springs from it. Birth is violent. The war that achieved the peace was violent. The spiky yellow sun in the corner of the child's drawing is violently exploding. It's what gives life to the world, and it's everywhere. Whatever their tone, their subject, Paul Hostovsky's poems understand that poetry itself, to co-opt one poem's phrase, is a kind of bruised silence, a swerving grace, a music made both of sound and the silence, which is more presence than absence. As readers, as listeners, we can be grateful for his poem's presence, and for the poet here with us today. Please welcome now Paul Hostovsky.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Hi, everybody. Wow, there are a lot more people here than there were 5 minutes ago before I ran to the bathroom and came back. Great, so happy Poetry Month to you too. And as I put my cell phone there with the clock on it, so I'll make sure not to go on and on and on, because there's nothing worse than a poet who gets up there and just keeps reading. When is he going to be done? Okay, so, yeah, so like Dr. Meek said, I am a sign language interpreter by profession, which means I do stuff like something like, if I went ahead and read my poems in sign language now, you all wouldn't understand a word of it, so that would be a dismal failure, right? Right? And then you're all supposed to say, right, right. Okay, so I won't do that. So I'll just jump right in and read a poem. Take it from there. This first one is called Coconut. Bear with me, I want to tell you something about happiness. It's hard to get at, but the thing is, I wasn't looking. I was looking somewhere else when my son found it in the fruit section and came running, holding it out in his small hands, asking me what it was and could we keep it? It only cost 99 cents, hairy and brown, hard as a rock, and something swishing around inside. And what on earth, and where on earth, and this was happiness, this little ball of interest beating inside his chest, this interestedness beaming out from his face, pleading happiness. And because I wasn't happy, I said to put it back, because I didn't want it, because we didn't need it. And because he was happy, he started to cry, right there in aisle 5. So when we got it home, we put it in the middle of the kitchen table and sat on either side of it and began to consider how to get inside of it. And the part that didn't make it into that poem is how I did finally get inside of that coconut, because I had never tried before. I didn't have much experience with coconuts until my son burst out crying in aisle 5 when I told him to put it back. So I went into the garage, got my sledgehammer, and I opened that coconut. It ended up all over the floor. That didn't make it into that poem, so maybe that's another poem. And this poem is called Everyone Was Beautiful. The day that everyone was beautiful was like any other day. The only difference was that everyone was beautiful, and the day itself was a beautiful summer day or spring day or one of those late winter days that smells like spring. And if it was fall, it was early fall, when it's all but technically summer, and everyone was simply beautiful, not sexy beautiful or movie star beautiful or drop-dead gorgeous beautiful, but everyone had this patina of slightly bruised longing, this shimmer of, I think I knew you when we were children, this look of, I've loved you ever since you were born, and probably longer than that. And it all started with the paper boy careening out of the blue dawn on his bicycle, pitching to the left and right, with his ballast of 50 today's papers in a vast canvas sack slung over his shoulder, balancing himself and the whole world on the tip of morning, the streets beginning to stir with shadows and workers and cars, all of which were perfectly beautiful, and it continued on like that throughout the day, with the gas station attendant and toll collectors and motorists and pedestrians and clerks, even the boss's boss, who always seemed an ugly sort of fellow, really, especially on the inside. But on that day, even the ugliness was beautiful. It was a beautiful ugliness, the day that everyone was beautiful, and the day itself was a beautiful summer day. This next one is called The Names. I want to say something about the names, Ahmed, Fuad, Tarek, Tawfiq, that are in the news these days, Yusuf, Anwar, Umar, Ishmael, and the way the newscasters have had to practice pronouncing them, Abdul, Amar, Abu, Muqtada al-Sadr. Don't you just love saying Muqtada al-Sadr? If you lined up all the names and just said them, one after the other, it would sound like you were fluent in Arabic. You could pull one over on your friends down at the pub, lubricate your tongue with a few beers, then turn to Jeff or Bill or Steve and say, Muqtada al-Sadr, Ahmed, Fuad, Abdul, Abu, Umar, Muhammad, and just wait for a reaction. Chances are a painful silence would swallow the pub whole, because everyone would think you had been praying or reciting a poem or a fatwa, when in fact all you were doing was saying the names, just lining them up and one by one firing off those frighteningly beautiful names. Let's see. This one is called Every American Child. Every American child will be issued a blues harmonica at birth and taught to bend the notes because the notes are for bending. And no American child will lock his harmonica up in a harmonica case, but will keep it in his pocket all his life, so that any lost, scattered, fallen, foreign thing, be it lint, pollen, tobacco, sleet, or spiders, may enter through the holes and take up residence there. And every American child will know how to inspect his blues harmonica without assistance or prompts, unscrewing the tiny bolts with his own fingernail, and without losing them or the even tinier serrated square nuts, remove the metal flanges and test each delicate reed by plucking it with the same fingernail to see if it rings true. And every American child will be required to carry his blues harmonica with him on his person at all times, and to produce his blues harmonica when asked for identification with the blues. And every American child will be expected to learn by heart the history of the blues, because the history of the blues is an American story, which some American grown-ups can't be trusted to tell, much less sing, to their American children. And just to make sure you're all awake, speaking of harmonicas, poetry training with Paul Hostovsky. All right. We all need a little diversion once in a while. From that deep, dark, serious poetry. God help us. Okay. Now some poets do a lot of research before writing their poems. I can't be said to be one of those poets, but this is a poem that I did do quite a bit of research on before writing it. And it's called A Woman Taking Off Her Shirt. That was a joke. A woman taking off her shirt. Does so with arms crossed over her belly like she's hugging herself, and each hand takes hold above the opposite hip, and off it comes in a fluid motion like a fountain shooting up and falling down in a great arc, the shirt rising up and the breasts rising and falling and the hair falling and finally the hands falling to her sides with the shirt in one hand inside out, while the man taking off his shirt wrestles it off, grabs his own collar first like he's going to beat himself up, then dips his chin down like a fighter into the dark well of the shirt and climbs down in it, reaching back and grabbing a hold and pulling it up over himself and pulleying himself down through it and out. Have you noticed that women always tend to do it like this, but men do it like this? Have you noticed that? Come on, am I the only one here? Did I discover that? So next time you're watching her or him taking off his or her shirt, what you should do is you should say, honey, wait, freeze, don't move. I want to read you this poem that I This guy with curly hair and glasses gave a poetry reading and read this incredible poem. So it'd be good foreplay, don't you think? Okay. How about Driving to Work with Britney Spears? You want to hear that one? Driving to Work with Britney Spears. I don't care what anyone says. I've had to pee so bad in traffic, I've pulled over in the breakdown lane where the courtships of small animals go on in the ravines. I've been so full of shit, I've had to turn the radio on just to drown me out. But I like her voice. I like her signature low note, that guttural thing she does that sounds like pushing, like she's climbed down into a ravine and she's squatting there among the animals, pushing. It could be a bowel movement. It could be a baby. It could be a second baby. Baby, baby, it's very effective, whatever it is. And I don't care what you think because I'm happy singing along on my way to work, my thumbs keeping time on my steering wheel, my head full of bullshit and beauty and Britney Spears pushing and singing and making babies. See, you don't have to write about lofty images and Greek gods and stuff. You can write about, the real human stuff, like that. Or like this one. This one's called Breasts Poem. Can I read you my Breasts poem? He went up to the poet after her reading and told her he loved her breasts. Poem. He paused after the word breasts, as though it came at the end of a line in a poem about breasts. He was being silly and also serious, the way Breasts are silly and serious, but she didn't see it that way. She was a very serious poet, and she didn't crack a smile. But her Breasts poem was full of the pleasures of connotations which he couldn't get out of his head. Jounce, for example, which sounds like joust, which carries with it pictures of women bouncing up and down on horseback, carrying poles under their armpits, called lances in the parlance of knights at a tournament. Jounce, the perfect word for when a female passes by like a song, like a poem with all the right words in all the right places, and he can't get it out of his head, and he wants to bash his head against another male head, just to get it out of his system, because whether he dies or whether he gets the girl with the jouncing breasts, either way, he will feel a hell of a lot better than sitting around at a lousy poetry reading in a flimsy folding chair, squirming with desire for those lovely breasts rising and falling, the lungs beneath them filling with the poem as the poem fills his head. That's a true story. Actually, I did that once. I went to a poetry reading, and there was a poet, rather reputable poet, whose name shall not be spoken here, who read a poem about breasts. And she in the poem, she talked about how she loved the word jounce, and talked about other things. And it was a funny poem, and it was a good poem. And after the reading, I went up to her, and I did exactly that, because I thought it was funny, I thought it was clever. I went up to her and I said, "I loved your breasts poem," you know? And like, she looked at me like, you know, like, get away from me. And like, I knew in that instant that I had failed, that it wasn't funny. I thought it was funny. I went and did that thing, and it's like, she didn't think it was funny, and I just kind of slunk away and felt really stupid. And, but I still think it's funny, and I thought it was funny, so I wrote this poem. And see, you're all laughing. And you know what? When I read this poem like yesterday and the day before at the other places, they laughed too. So it works. So I was right in the first place. So that's good. That makes me feel better. Thank you. Okay. Well, continuing with this same theme, let's see. This next poem is called "Wincing at the Beautiful." You know what that looks like? Wincing at the beautiful? Looks like this. Right? Okay. Wincing at the beautiful. So my friend Phil is telling me how he can't get a date, how he loves women, and how they're always giving him looks. So I ask him what kind of looks. So he winces at the beautiful, braless young woman passing by at that particular propitious moment, giving her a look of such longing and longevity that she returns his look with a look that kills his entire family tree. From the roots to the unimagined blossoms of the great-grandchildren shriveling on his shriveling bough. And I think I've diagnosed his problem now, and I think of quoting some lines from Rilke, but on second thought, I think a sports metaphor might serve him better. So I steer the conversation round to basketball and the 3-second rule, which says you can only stand inside the key for 3 seconds before they blow the whistle. They're just blowing the whistle on you, Phil, for breaking the 3-second rule, for standing there with your eyes popping out like basketballs. It's a game like any other, I tell him. Then I ask him if he wants to score. And now that I have his attention, I throw in those lines from Rilke. I tell him that beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, we're still just able to bear. And the reason we adore it so is that it serenely disdains to destroy us. And he winces again, and this time it's at the beauty of those lines, or maybe their truth, which hits him like a three-pointer now that Rilke has hit all the way from Germany at a distance of 100 years. So again, this is a true story. This friend of mine, Phil, he's like, that was his problem. He didn't know about the 3-second rule. He didn't know he could look at a very beautiful woman, but then you have to look away. You're not allowed to just keep staring. You can't do that. And that's what this guy did. No one ever told him that. So he was miserable. And so I wrote that poem for him, and for all I know, he's probably still doing it. I don't think he learned the lesson, but. Okay, how are we doing here for time? Got time for some more. All right, maybe I'll read one more poem in this vein, and then maybe switch gears. So this one is called. This one is called. Wait a minute, I lost my place. Maybe I won't read that one. Maybe I'll read this one instead. The Conversations of Men. I'll read that one, in case you're wondering what men talk about when women aren't around, as if you didn't know. Or maybe you don't know. The Conversations of Men. My girlfriend says she would like to be a fly on the wall between two urinals. What would she overhear, she asks me. I tell her the last time a man spoke to me above a urinal, I think he said, "How about them Bruins?" And what did I say in return, she wants to know. I say I didn't know what to say because I don't know anything about hockey. And I didn't watch the game or even know there was one. But I didn't want him to know that, so I think I said, "God damn," because it sounded heartfelt, yet non-committal. Because he may or may not have been a Bruins fan, and because the Bruins may or may not have won. And because he was trying to make contact with his gender, and if I said I didn't see the game, or if I said I didn't follow hockey or don't give a shit about the Bruins, he would probably feel like he hadn't made contact, and I would feel less of a man. So I said, "God damn," and he said, "Unbelievable," and shook his head in approval. Or maybe it was disapproval. It was hard to tell, I tell her, because the whole thing was more or less peripheral. Peripheral, you get it? That's how conversations take place above urinals. Peripheral. Okay, stick with me here. So, Garrison Keillor of Prairie Home Companion and Writer's Almanac has been very kind to me, and he's read some of my poems on NPR, on Writer's Almanac. And this is one that he read, and I have a sort of a funny story to tell you about what happened after he read this poem on the radio. And the poem is called exegesis, which is sort of a fancy word that means an explanation of a text or a passage in a text, or in this case, a song lyric. We couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, sitting on that green bench in the late 60s or early 70s, me and Michael Zucker, who was much more savvy and world-weary than I, when I asked him to please explain the meaning of the words to a song by Carly Simon, who was simply gorgeous. That much was plain. after we'd resolved the essential question of whether or not she was wearing a bra in that photo of her with the blue top and thick lips on her album cover. I don't get it, I said. You're so vain, you probably think this song is about you. But the song is about him, isn't it? I asked Zucker, holding my palm up in the air like one who is trying to ascertain the truth about whether or not it has started to rain. Zucker looked away then, gingerly fingering the green slats, as though he were reading the carved names of the lovers and obscenities tactually. Then he took a deep breath and exhaled miserably, took the album cover out of my hands, and gazed a while at Carly Simon, who was gorgeous, famous, braless, and older than me and Zucker put together. That's the point, he said. She's in love with him. Okay, so whatever that's worth, but so before the reading, one of Dr. Meek's classes was here, and we were talking about, among other things, using the real names in my poems, which I tend to use the names of people from my childhood and memories that I have. So in this case, Michael Zucker this happened, it's happened pretty much this way when I knew him when we were, like it says, like 12 or 13. It was in summer camp. And anyway, so Garrison Keillor, read the poem on the air, and the next day I get an email from Michael Zucker, whom I hadn't seen or heard from in 40 years, saying, Paul Hostovsky, I was driving to the airport yesterday and I had the radio on, and all of a sudden I heard your name. And then I heard my name. And I just about drove through the guardrail. And how you doing anyway? So, and so we emailed back and forth, and he said, I don't remember that happening. And I said, it happened, and you said that. He said, well, it sounds like something I might say. But he did, he explained that to me. So the reason she says that is because she's in love with him. How many of you know that song, by the way? I know it's like, it's an old song, yeah. So, anyway, so I thought that was funny. Okay, I'm going to read just a few more. Won't keep you much longer. This one's called Visitation. I learned that word after I got divorced. Visitation, apparently, divorced dads and angels are in the business of visitation. That's what they call it when we get to spend time with our kids. Visitation. I make him the best lunches, though. I mean, I made his mother a lousy best friend. I mean, I made her a little miserable. So she kicked me off the team for being what she called a lousy team player. I concede I am a lousy team player. I never coached Little League or basketball or soccer, and I only make it to a handful of his games. But I make him the best lunches, a sandwich to beat all sandwiches, every single Thursday and every other Monday, which he takes with him to school in a brown paper sack in a pouch on the abdomen of his backpack. A sandwich to make his friends say, a little ruefully, a little wistfully, man, your mother makes the best lunches, when really it's his father who engineers these miracles, these visitations of the angel of lunches, these mothers of all lunches, every single Thursday and every other Monday when I have him, when he sleeps over and I have another chance to make it right. Okay, and another one about that little boy of mine who is now yay big and And before I came out here, he said, so you're gonna read some poems, huh, Dad? You gonna read that one about me? You gonna read the one about the coconut? I said, yeah, I probably will. It's like my biggest hit. He said, well, don't read the one about the best lunches. You gonna read that one too? I said, yeah, I'll probably read that one too. He said, are you gonna read the one about me and you driving to school when I said that thing? I said, yeah, I'm gonna read that one too. And I'm gonna read that one right now. It's called Conversations with My Son. Conversations with My Son. I think maybe this will be the last one. I've been going for about 40 minutes, which is too much. Poetry, it's like very fine, very rich chocolate. You should only have like a few in one sitting. You don't want to overdo it. Too much of a good thing. It might make you sick. I don't want to make anybody sick. All right, Conversations with My Son. Houdini-esque and 8 years old, he snakes out of his seatbelt on our way to Peabody Elementary School and rests his little mug just behind my ear. Here he puts a metaphysical question, a prestidigitation of the mind. Where is Cleveland, Ohio, Dad? And before I can answer, another question. Would you rather be buried or crucified? I ask if he means cremated. He asks me, what's the difference? I tell him, and he says, well, I just don't think you should take up too much space when you're dead, Dad. For Pete's sake, I mutter, and he's right there with another question. Who's Pete, and what's Pete's ache? Together we watch the road to school unfold like a familiar story, while I tell him the story of Pete, the guy who said he loved Jesus so much he would die for him. That was his ache, I say. But when the time came, when the soldiers all came with their swords blazing like the sun, Pete got scared and he ran away, and he didn't do what he said he would do, and that was Pete's ache too. I think I'd rather be crucified, he says, as I pull in behind a school bus, and I'm not quite sure if he means he would choose the pain of the nails over the pain of the betrayal, or the fire over a pine box in the earth. Before I can ask him, he's out. He's unbuckled his belt, unlocked the door, and reappeared outside, running up the hill, his little backpack full of tools bouncing on his shoulders, a head on his shoulders full of questions, questions escaping all over. Thank you very much.
A few minutes for questions.
If there are no questions, we could always,
I have a request while people are thinking of their questions.
A harmonica request?
Well, no. Could you read the violence of the violin?
Sure, I'd be happy to. But the one thing about this poem, that when I read it out loud, when I read it out loud at a reading, it occurred to me that, does everybody know what, you picture a violin? Actually, there's one here, you probably can't see it. You know, like on a violin, there are those holes that are carved into the side, you know what they're called? F-hole, right, they're called an F-hole, which sounds kind of obscene, and that didn't register until I read this poem aloud at a reading, and I thought, and it was probably like right after one of the poems that is obscene, and then I thought, oh man, that didn't work. So this poem is not obscene, and it's not supposed to be funny. So, and it does mention the F-hole. And now it's hopeless, I know, as soon as I say that. I burst out laughing. I appreciate that you laughed at the funny ones, but sometimes people laugh at the serious ones, and then I don't know. Or they don't laugh at the funny ones, so you can never tell. Okay. the violence of the violins. It was in them, they would say. It was what they were, what they did. It was part of them, carved into them like an F-hole, like a cleft tattooed onto a biceps. And there was nothing you could say or do to change that. It was their way. It was the way of the world, and also of the sun, exploding 1,000,000 miles away, warming your soft cheek. Face the music, they would say. Stop listening with your eyes closed. See the string tightened almost to breaking, the bow torturing it into song. Feel the skin stretched over the drum so tightly it makes your heart pound. And where did you think it all came from? The easy melody, the high tinkling finery. We are hurt into beauty. And you, up in the balcony, rising to your feet, applauding fiercely, look down at what your own hands are doing.
Any questions? Yes.
Do you ever do your poems in sign language for people?
I have not, and people have asked me about that, but it's not something that I have done. Maybe one day I will. What I would like to do is work with a deaf poet who is more fluent than I and more qualified than I am to make a poem in American Sign Language or to translate some of my poems into sign language. I don't really feel qualified to do that myself, but maybe one day. Yes.
Kind of a similar note. This is something that Sandy touched on in our introduction. I mean, it's interesting to me that you write poetry and you're also a sign language interpreter, and so this that kind of this art of silence and then also this art of sound. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to the intersections between those, if you see them complementing each other in any particular way.
Well, I think that I do, that's how I make my living, so I am signing much of the day, and my wife is deaf, and my daughter's deaf, and my boss is deaf, and my plumber's deaf, and a lot of my friends are deaf, so I'm using sign language much of the time. How that influences my poems, I really have no idea. I like silence. I love music too, but I don't listen to music as much as I used to. When I was younger, I always, I had a stereo and a record collection, and I listened to a lot of music. I always had music playing in the background, but I don't do that now. I don't like having music playing in the background, but I still love music, and I get these weird things happen. Like I'll be walking down the food aisle in the supermarket, and all of a sudden some song comes on, and from 1970 something or whatever, and I freeze, and I'm listening to that song. I remember that song. I really loved that song, and I just, and sometimes, I get all choked up from the music. It actually happened when I was at Brunel a couple of days ago. Before the reading, we were at a cafe, and you remember that song, Please Come to Boston for this man? I'm the one man, fan of the man from Tennessee. I was sitting there with another very kind English professor who was accompanying me, and she had gone to the restroom when that song came on. I was sitting there by myself with my cup of tea and listening to that song. I remember that song. And I got all choked up just from that song, And she came back and she said, "Are you all right?" It's nothing. It was embarrassing. So what's my point? My point is, I love music. It touches me deeply, and yet, I need silence too. I love it, and cherish silence for my writing, for my reading. I can't read when the TV's going or the radio's on, there's music. And I have two young stepkids now, 10 and 12, and they make a lot of noise, and So I don't know, I mean, I don't have any answers, but I noticed that it's, you know, it's interesting, you know, but deaf people are anything but silent, that's sort of a, you know, deaf people make a lot of noise. Matter of fact, there are what's called attention-getting, what do you call this? How do you get a deaf person's attention? You know, they can't hear you, so you don't go, John, I can't hear you. So what you usually do is, you make too much noise here because there's a microphone, but like if I wanted to get her attention and she's deaf, I would go like this, because deaf people can feel and sometimes hear the low, you know, so when there are deaf people in a room, there's a lot of this, there's a lot of signing, so, you know, and they're laughing, they vocalize, you know, they make a lot of noise. So, you know, it's not like being around deaf people is not being around silence. It's just being around different sounds, and of course the language is visual. It's not sound. It's a different modality. But you know, and I have some poems. I didn't read any of them today, but I have some poems about deaf people and about the beauty of sign language, trying to praise it. So I guess that's another way that it shows up in my poems. Thanks for that question.
Any other questions?
All right, thanks
One
again.
more over here.
One more?
Chelsea?
Yeah. Always like to know when poets start writing, or how that, like, when did that click in your mind, or just, like, what point in your life, you're like, I'm gonna write poems and, you know, hopefully gonna publish, or just did you always write as a child, or when did that start?
Well, my father was a writer, so he wrote novels, and he was from Czechoslovakia. He was much older. He was older. He was 53 when I was born. So, and he died when I was 14. But so I knew that people did that there were writers in the world, and that my father was a famous writer in his home country. He never achieved the same kind of success here in the States, but there were books all around the house, and I knew my father was a famous writer. And there was a room in the house where his books were. And many of them, he had written like 12 or 15 books, and they'd all been translated into various languages: French, German, Italian, English, which is how I read them in English because I don't speak Czech. He wrote in Czech. Japanese even. And I remember bringing my friends in when I was a kid. Come here, I'll show you something. You go into that room, and there was like 3 shelves of books with my name on them. Hostovsky. You know, like showed off to my friends about my father being a famous writer. So the reason I mention that is because like I had it in my head that, you know, it'd be a pretty cool thing to do, you know, to write. But he didn't write poetry, so how did I start writing poetry? So it was shortly after he died, I guess. No, it was before he died. I was in the 5th grade. How old are you in the 5th grade? 10? 10. So I was 10. Yeah, so it was before he died. So it was Mrs. Cunningham. It's all her fault. I had a crush on Mrs. Cunningham, my 5th grade teacher. She was probably like your age. She was probably like in her 20s. She was very pretty. And we did a poetry unit in class, and so I sort of had a crush on her. And then we did a poetry unit, and I wanted to impress her, but I was also really into the poems, and a lot of poems by Robert Frost. I remember he was my first love. And I think that's when I started writing, you know. So initially it was to impress a woman. Things haven't changed much. But so yeah, so I started very young. So I guess, you know, I was 5th grade. And then after my father died, I wrote a lot of deaf poems. And I've always written, except for a while when I was in college. And for some reason I had a bad experience in college, and I decided that I sucked, that I wasn't any good, and why continue? So I just stopped writing for a few years, and then after college I started up again, and been doing it ever since. Cool.
Yeah.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody. Appreciate it.